So
I thought we were just with our panelists. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this event hosted by the Center for Middle East Studies at the College of International Studies at the University of Oklahoma. My name is Scott Fritzen. I'm the dean of that college. You've already had an interesting introduction to me, but we were completely flustered here as I could not log on. So allow me first to introduce our distinguished panelists in alphabetical order, and then we'll launch right into the heart of the teach-in, which is to have some opening remarks from each of the panelists, some 5 minutes each, followed by Q&A. So without further ado, Ms. Fereshta Abbasi is a human rights lawyer who previously advised the Afghanistan Attorney General's office and who has worked with Human Rights Watch, Global Family Care, and Voice, and who joins us now from London. Thank you, Fereshta, for joining us. Professor Mike Boettcher is the Gaylord Visiting Professional Professor and a veteran network news correspondent at the University of Oklahoma. Mike has reported extensively from Iraq and Afghanistan, among many other places, and in fact left NBC News in 2008 to pursue the No Ignoring Project, the only entity embedded full-time with U.S. troops fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. Thank you, Mike, for joining us.
Thank you.
Colonel Christian Cabaniss is a military operations analyst. As commander of the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, and deputy division commander of the 2nd Marine Division, Colonel Cabaniss oversaw some of the most significant military operations against the Taliban in southern Afghanistan. After his retirement from military service, he has become a prominent advocate for more focus on the mental health of Afghan veterans. Thank you, Colonel Cabaniss, for joining us. Professor Joshua Landis is the Sandra Mackey Chair in Middle East Studies at the Department of International and Area Studies here in the College of International Studies, University of Oklahoma. He is also director of both the Center for Middle East Studies and the Farzaneh Family Center for Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies. Thank you, Joshua, for organizing this. And finally, Dr. Mohammad Qadam Shah joins us from Seattle, where he is assistant professor of global development at Seattle Pacific University. He holds a PhD from the University of Washington, where his dissertation focused on an evaluation of development aid in Afghanistan. He has also previously served on the faculty of the School of Law and Political Sciences at Balkh University in Afghanistan. Welcome, Mohammad. Good to see you. So with that, may I propose that we go again in alphabetical order and invite Fereshta to please give us some opening remarks for 5 minutes or so.
Thank you very much, Scott, for providing the opportunity to discuss the issues related to Afghanistan. I know that Afghanistan has been in the headlines of media for the past 2 weeks or so, but it's very important to hear the local voice. For the past 2 weeks, I have been committed to echo what I hear from the people on the ground. And that's one of the things that I want to discuss about it in this webinar as well. I speak with a very heavy heart as I regularly talk to friends, family members, and relatives who are left in Kabul at this difficult situation. I just heard that the last American plane left Afghanistan like 30 minutes ago or so. And I saw that the moment that the plane left the Kabul airport, the Taliban have started shooting victory fire guns and celebratory fire guns there. This situation, the atmosphere and the feeling is full of disappointment out there. People are very scared. We don't know what is next. Nobody knows what is going to happen. Tomorrow will be a new beginning for Afghan people who don't know what will the future look like. I get very emotional discussing about all these issues, but I have been closely following what happened in Afghanistan since the fall of the first provinces. I have been talking to the local people. When Helmand fall, I was talking to local people in Helmand. And then it came to Ghazni and then Herat and finally Kabul, which I never imagined, never expected that such a thing would happen. I mean, I just want to focus on the effects on how the local life have changed in the past 2 weeks. In terms of women's rights, although that the Taliban officials keep insisting that they will grant the right to work and right to education to women according to the principles of Islam. But the fact is that what they do practically on the ground is contradictory with what they say. When they took over Helmand, although there was a lot of fights and everything going on, but I was talking to the female journalists there that they were not able to go to their offices. No woman actually was going out when they take over Helmand. When they took over Ghazni, I was talking to people there, especially my relatives there. Women were not allowed to go out. They gathered all elders in a mosque and announced their rules. Women were not allowed to go out without a male chaperone. We were not allowed to go out for work, and also they have to always be in a full hijab burqa. And I mean, few days later they took over Kabul. The situation that is happening, I mean, what is happening in Kabul at the moment does not represent what is happening in whole Afghanistan. We know that the Taliban are looking for international recognition this time. They're looking for legitimacy. So they know that the international media is still present in Kabul. So what they do in Kabul does not represent what they really, what really looks like on the ground. In the provinces, the normal life really looks like back like 1990s. In Kabul, women businesses are closed. Women are not going to work. Female governmental employees were not allowed to get into the governmental offices. Women journalists are not going to their offices. So I don't see a lot of change and differences between the Taliban shadow government in 1990s and what is happening in 2021 in Kabul these days. And that's one of my biggest concerns, that Taliban are not reliable and they have not changed much. I mean, in opposite with what they say, what they do on the ground and what their forces are doing in the ground shows that their mentality is the same. And that's what really concerns me, because the young generation of Afghanistan have worked for a new Afghanistan, a different environment. And I don't know how they will cope with Taliban in the future.
Thank you, Ms. Abbasi. I appreciate that. Next, we have Professor Mike Boettcher.
You know, in thinking back over the last 20 years and key moments, it wasn't a big battle or some big diplomatic triumph or failure that sticks with me. It's one little incident that occurred in Helmand province, and Colonel Cabaniss commanded U.S. Marines in that area. And there was an operation as we were moving south down the Helmand River Valley. And along the way, the Marines were asked to clear kalats, which are the farming compounds with walls around them and usually a metal door in the front. And as the Marines went to each compound, they would knock on that metal door. If no one answered, they'd have to kick in the door, breach the door. And in one instance, we stop at a kalat. The door is knocked on, no one comes. They knock again, no one comes. So the Marines kicked in the door. That was the metal door to the compound. And that was procedure so they could clear it to make sure Taliban weren't hiding there. The elder who ran the Kalat came out front, and along with the captain who was in charge of this particular unit, there was a Marine behind him with a backpack that had money in it. And when they found that there were no weapons that they could find that were unusual outside the normal weapons a person would have in Oklahoma or in Helmand province, the captain instructed the young Marine to pay the elder for the damage done to the door. And he was handing him the money, and the elder said, "I don't want your money. I just want my door fixed. What am I going to do with that cash here anyway?" I mean, he's in the middle of nowhere in Helmand province. With, to spend anything, he's going to have to go a great distance. He didn't want the money. And I talked to him further on after this incident with the translator, and was asking him about his connection to Kabul and a central government. He knew nothing really about a central government in Kabul. And so to me, that was instructive then. It's still stuck in my mind, but that maybe in Kabul, in the more metropolitan area, we were getting through to some segments of the population. But outside of Kabul, in all these various provinces, there was not a connection, because the focus of the United States effort was from the top down, dealing with the central government and the money that would be used to do projects and other things. Bigger projects would trickle down to the district level. Well, by the time it went to the various layers of corruption on some of these projects, there wasn't a whole lot of money left. So I look back on my time in Afghanistan as a reporter, seeing the signs, but not doing my job and trying to put them into perspective. I put that into a story, but there needed to be more focus. And frankly, Americans are saying, what happened? Well, all Americans have to do is look themselves in the mirror, because Americans didn't give a damn. If you look at the last year of coverage in Afghanistan before the withdrawal, each network devoted 5 minutes in a year to Afghanistan. Let that soak in. 5 minutes or less. America wasn't paying attention. Also, I think one of the things that really hurt the American campaign in Afghanistan was the constant changeover every year of new command. You've heard it many times before. It wasn't a 20-year war we fought, it was 21-year wars, because each commanding general would come in with and want to put his own imprint on that current strategy. And I was going down, it became a counter strategy, and I made a list of the various counter things I could remember. At one point, it was counter-terror, then counterinsurgency, then counter-narcotics, then counter-corruption, then counter-threat finance. And I'm sure there are many other counters you could find. But every year that strategy changed. Continuity was rough. It wasn't quite there. In the end, and I want to end my 5 minutes this way, in commenting on the service that young American men and women in uniform did. I can remember a battle that I was in 2011 in Kunar province in the mountains. It was an air assault. We came into an area that Americans had never been before, and even we were told the Soviet Union never entered that area. We were pretty quickly surrounded by the Taliban, which had a superior force. Immediately, we took casualties. And there was a young medic named Jameson Linskog who heard over the radio that there was an American soldier and an Afghan soldier wounded. He put on his medical backpack and ran through a hail of gunfire to get to that Afghan soldier and that American soldier. We came in behind him, and Jamison Linskog had been shot several times and was still instructing his soldiers who had not been shot how to treat those soldiers, both Afghan and American, who were wounded. And right before he died, he apologized for dying. He was apologizing for not being there, being able to help his buddies throughout this, not for some grand geopolitical strategy, but for his buddies to the left and to the right of them. And in the end, that's what the American soldiers and Marines and sailors and airmen were fighting for. They were following their orders, but in the end, they were fighting for each other. And I would say, basically, the bottom line is, and what I've heard commanders tell soldiers, is you can't want it more than they do. And in the end, it was the United States and its representatives on the ground in Afghanistan that wanted it more than the Afghans they had been sent to try to protect, to build a democracy. Certainly that was something that Americans wanted, but in the end, outside of Kabul and in those areas that no one really talks about, I was never convinced in my time on the ground that they wanted it more than we did.
Thank you, Professor Boettcher. Over to you, Colonel Cabaniss.
Now, Mike won't believe this, but I'm going to actually be brief. I might give you back a couple of minutes. As an Afghan vet and talking to Afghan vets, the one thing that is pervasive to me is vets are angry for a variety of reasons. I don't presume to speak for all of them because they have their own reasons. But the question that they're asking themselves is, was it worth it? They lost friends. They watched friends disappear in a pink mist. As Mike kind of alluded to, they wonder, all the wounds, everything, was it worth it? Another side of that house is people that left Afghan partners behind, and it's not just interpreters. There were many Afghans that we fought with that didn't speak English, that didn't work for the U.S. government, who are now running for their lives, and we've made no real effort to get out so far, and that's something that's very concerning. And one thing that I'm really concerned about is it's opening old wounds. For my Marines that Mike knows, most of them, their Afghan experience is a decade ago. But the events over the last 10 days have reopened all those old wounds. All of them have come back. And they don't really understand how to process them. And while the VA is great these days, it maybe wasn't so much 10 years ago. And so there's a huge issue with getting people to trust the government, to trust the VA, to go back and get care. Because I do think all these vets are value added to our nation back here, but there's some work to be done. But all this kind of pales in comparison to what's going on with the Afghans right now as a people. There are many good people in Afghanistan. I hate the broad brush that maybe some at the top that weren't so great doesn't compare with my experience with people at the bottom. As Mike would say, they never said they were from Afghanistan. They said they were from Garmsir. Now, I did a tour in Kabul early in the war, and so I have some experiences there with that part of the war. But my experience in Helmand, in Garmsir, was a lot more formative to understand how the Afghan people were trying to process what was happening them around them. As Mike kind of alluded to, we've talked about Afghanistan more in the last 10 days than we've talked about it in the last 10 years. But again, we didn't talk about it much in 2009. You may remember one of my Marines, Corporal Brady Bunch, actually said, "America's at the mall, America's not at war." And he said that back in 2009. So again, these are the things that we're processing right now. And I'm not sure. Now, I would say that we changed the world because we changed individual Afghans. Not all of us. Some things we did were not great, but many young Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen positively impacted Afghans that they interacted with, whose lives are going to be changed forever. The question I have, and better for y'all to answer than me, is can you put the genie back in the bottle? Many of these Afghans have experienced a different kind of world than they had before. And so can you go all the way back to where you were? That's going to be a challenge because I'm not sure I buy that the Taliban are different. My experience with them tell me that it's going to be hard for them to be different, especially with women. But as I used to tell my Afghan partners in Garam Seer, show me a country that doesn't empower its women and I'll show you a third world country. So my hope for the people of Afghanistan is they have a better future in front of them, a brighter future than maybe what they experienced in the past. But I know right now that that future is very uncertain.
Thank you, Colonel Cabaniss. Professor Landis.
I'd like to speak about three things. One is the notion of defeat, that America is going to be weaker because it has left Afghanistan. And third, that our allies will abandon us because they'll look at the Afghan example. Defeat. Who is responsible for this defeat? I think responsibility is squarely on the shoulders of George Bush. Why? Because he turned Afghanistan into a mission impossible, which was to turn it into a liberal democracy, something America could not do. And he set our soldiers up for defeat, and the United States up for defeat, but he also created thousands of Afghans who were dependent on the United States, who trusted the United States to continue with its mission and not to leave, who are now left behind, if you will, and who've put their faith in the United States and built up a record of supporting the United States, which is going to get them to terrible danger, of course, in the future. President Trump and Biden are the ones who've tried to get us out of this mission impossible. And Trump made a deal back in February of 2020 in which he asked the Taliban, he told the Taliban, we will leave by May if you do not shoot us. And that deal was accepted by the Taliban, and it allowed us to draw our troops down to 2,000 men. Now, the notion that we were going to be able to leave without a mess is hard to believe, because as soon as it became clear that America was going to leave, everybody changed sides, and the president left the country, and the whole place collapsed, as we saw, leading to this very messy exit. But the notion that we could have stayed with those 2,000 troops and ruled Afghanistan isn't convincing, because the Taliban would have attacked us. The reason that no American soldiers were killed in that last year was because they had held up their side of the agreement more or less, and were not attacking us. And for us to have stayed would have required putting a lot more troops in there, breaking this agreement, and everything would have gone back to the way it was. So I think it's important to understand that defeat was cooked in there from the very beginning. The notion of weakness. I don't think there's any evidence that this is going to make America weaker. In fact, I think the opposite is true. America is going to be stronger because it's gotten out of a bad situation. Now, George Kennan, when he was talking about Vietnam, said there is more respectability to be won in the opinion of the world by a resolute and courageous liquidation of unsound positions, and rather than stubbornly pursue the same thing. And I think that's true for America here. We saw after Vietnam, there were no domino theories. In fact, it was the Soviet Union that collapsed. Eastern Europe turned to the West and turned to NATO. NATO didn't collapse. Our East Asian allies didn't turn to China or Russia. They stayed with us. And I think that same thing is true today. That we don't have real national interests in Afghanistan. We do in places like Germany to contain Russia. We do in South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. And just the other day, Wolfowitz was on TV saying that Taiwan, Israel, Japan will draw the lesson that it's on its own. I don't think that's a lesson they're going to draw. I think that they will see that America is going to pivot to Asia. It is going to be much more prepared to husband its resources and to follow its national interests now that we're no longer stuck in Afghanistan and places like Iraq. And this was the problem with the Vietnam War. In 1967, the war between the Arabs and Israel broke out in large part because Johnson told the Israelis, I cannot intervene and do anything for you. I'm busy in Vietnam. If he had not been busy in Vietnam, he might have been able to intervene and stop the war which lost the West Bank and turned this into a big conflict. So I would like to, remind our audience that those three things, defeat, weakness, that we're going to lose our allies. We're hearing a lot of people criticizing the president for getting us out of this, but I think that he's done the only thing that makes sense, and it's been a courageous move, and even though it's been very messy. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. And Dr. Qadam Shah, you're next.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I deeply share the feeling and concern with Fereshta. Thank you for everybody else to share your feeling. And it's a really hard time. I remember I was born in 1987, and I was 2 years old that my family had to leave Afghanistan. The Soviet Union was going to fall and going to leave Afghanistan, withdraw from Afghanistan. Now, after 30 plus years, I'm witnessing another withdrawal by another great power, that is United States. So my remark is going kind of matching with most of the things that you mentioned, specifically with Professor Landis' point of defeat, that it was from the beginning doomed to fail. And that is in fact the topic of the book that I'm working with my one of my PhD dissertation supervisor, and we have titled the book as Built to Fail. And the focus of the book is in fact on the governance structure that Afghanistan, with the support of the international community, especially US, adopted in 2001. So what I would like to highlight in 5 minutes is that from the beginning, as Dr. Landis mentioned, there was a paradox in the process, in the sense that under different strategies and through different processes that they took it, from counter-terrorism, counter-insurgency, and ultimately to promote liberal democracy in Afghanistan, there was a very deeply concerning paradox from the beginning. And that was the governance structure that the Afghan elites, by elite I refer to the Western technocrats, and the international community led by US, promoted in Afghanistan. This was a system that Afghanistan adopted in 1880, when Great Britain, with the very geopolitical goal of using Afghanistan as a buffer zone against Russia, helped centralize Afghanistan, and they supported militarily and financially the then King of Afghanistan, Abdurrahman, who created a system that was centralized, subjugated all other minorities, and suppressed any resistance, and basically killed thousands of innocent minority groups, including the minority that I'm from. So this system continued, and then Britain lost interest in Afghanistan, and they left Afghanistan. It was Soviet Union's turn, and it coincided with the Second World War, where US and the Soviet Union were competing to take control of more third world countries, and Afghanistan was one of them. This time, Afghanistan destiny fell into the hands of the Soviet Union, and Soviet Union, as their system suggested, they needed to have a very centralized system where, one, they could control the foreign policy of Afghanistan, and second, they were happy to have a communist system in Afghanistan. The Soviet Union also failed, of course, with the fall of the Soviet Union and all other geopolitical strategies that US and other major powers in the region took against Afghanistan. Soviet Union failed, and they had to withdraw Afghanistan and leave it again. So then Taliban took over. They had the same sort of system, and 2001 started. Afghanistan had a new opportunity to deviate from the past and start a new path towards liberal democracy, the very golden goal that US set for Afghanistan. Although the liberal democracy that US is practicing is the standard, was going to be a standard for Afghanistan, but Afghanistan adopted a very different system that was very similar to what Great Britain and Soviet Union implemented and in fact created in Afghanistan. So this system is a very top-down centralized system of governance. And as Mike mentioned, there is no connection between the central government and the localities. And as Mike's mentioned, most of the people do not even know who the president is and who the central government is. So this system, in fact, gives all the political, fiscal, and administrative authorities to the president, and provide no constraints on the power of the president, so that he is accountable to some sort of constraints. And it ultimately becomes a very corrupt system. And throughout the last 20 years, we have seen that billions of dollars have been flowed into Afghanistan system, but because the system has no constraints on it and it is not accountable to anyone, the money was just wasted and resulted in no improvement in the lives of the Afghan people who were the main beneficiaries of these aids. So to make it short, I just want to mention, back to my point, that from the beginning, the system that Afghanistan adopted in 2001 was not doomed to have a success, because it was the continuity of the system that Afghanistan adopted in 1880. Although there are some changes in the system, but if you look at the system at its core, it is very centralized. It is a very dictatorial system. It's not prone to democracy. It's not prone to inclusion and participation of the local population. So you cannot imagine, and I myself as an Afghan had lost hope from this system many years ago. And it was something that me and my supervisor, in fact, had predicted, that this system is not going to work. And you can spend, the problem in Afghanistan was not money. The problem in Afghanistan was the governance and institutions. The governance and institutions in Afghanistan are not responsive to the social, political, and cultural realities of Afghanistan. It is just promoting a dictator, or the better way to interpret the system is that it is just, it might be successful for the supporters. For example, the three great powers that came to Afghanistan to achieve their geopolitical goals. And for some small group of Afghan elites who have been mostly Western technocrats, especially during the last 20 years. So other than that, as some of you touched base here and there, I think the core of the problem in Afghanistan is the governance system. And something to warn the international community and the Taliban is that if they do not listen to the history lesson, to the lessons that the history is providing about Afghanistan, Afghanistan is going to be another Syria or Libya or some situation like Iraq. So these groups needs to get together and form a system that really work for the future of Afghanistan. Otherwise, we'll have the same story happening again and again. Thank you.
Thank you all very much, and also for keeping to the time, which now gives us ample opportunity to go into some questions, and they're coming in very quickly now. By the way, we have 86 participants today. All right, I'd like to start off with a comment by one individual who wrote the following, and I'm just going to read it. I spent 2 years in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq as a strategic communication advisor, advising both the Afghan Minister of Interior and Minister of Defense, as well as providing advice to coalition leadership. The former, i.e. the Minister of Interior and Defense, listened and really wanted to know how to engage extremists in the country. The latter did not, and were fixated in counter techniques versus proactive efforts. The fact that the United States evacuated Afghanistan before extracting its Afghan partners says volumes on the lack of planning, or worse, knowing how the evacuation would happen. While 2 of my interpreters made it out, others didn't, and I think that is shameful. The credibility of the United States to other partners is now in jeopardy more than ever, and non-state and state actors. Comment, please. So this is not directed to anyone in particular, but if anyone would like to take on this particular comment, thought I'd give you the opportunity.
I'll jump in on a personal level. I mean, for those of us, and I understand the geopolitics, well, I kind of understand the geopolitics of it all, but on a personal level, for people that we know, for my interpreters who have family members in country, we do feel shame that we couldn't get them out. So I understand that feeling. I don't know in our system, and my daughter works for a member of Congress, so I kind of understand the rules, and she was helping with immigration rules. Most of the people that we're talking about don't qualify under any existing program to immigrate to the United States. And so how do you, I saw a New York Times article that said 250,000. I mean, there's a yeoman effort on the ground to get 100,000 out, let alone 250,000. But again, on a personal level, I understand that completely. But I'll defer to others about the politics and about how others view us based on what we did.
Mike, I think you were starting to answer, but we're on mute.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had myself on mute. You know, I was, you know, the Taliban has a saying, and I've actually heard it in other parts of the world, that the Americans have the watches, but we have the time. And I think long term, throughout the course of this war, as it went on and on, that clock was ticking, and there was going to be no good way to end this whatsoever. But I think if we were going to make a move to end this war earlier than it already had been ended, and maybe in a better way, the time to do that would have been during the Obama administration, when we had the surge going, and we resurged back into Afghanistan with over 100,000 boots on the ground. At that point, I think it could have been a pivot point to say, okay, we've secured as best we are going to be able to do, and move to aggressively at that point to a political solution. And one thing I'd like to something Josh said, I disagree. I think there will be long-term effects and other conflicts that we will see ourselves in. And I probably this is a product of, my experience in my own life, but, I go back to Lebanon in 1982 and 83, when I was working there during the Israeli invasion, Sabra and Shatila massacre, leading into the Marine barracks bombing. And when those Western peacekeepers came in, and what would become Hezbollah, and this attack was designed by a terrorist named Imad Mubniya, Once that bomb took 241 Marine lives, we got out of there in a hurry. And so did our Western partners. And what was left behind, because we had no presence, could not engage, really contributed to the growth of Hezbollah, and Israel would have that experience dealing with them, a stronger, more organized Hezbollah, because the West pulled out. And if you look at the chaos that ensued afterwards, kidnappings that occupied our times, and executions of Westerners, it was, and Lebanese themselves. And I think that every time we leave something behind for good and leave nothing in its place or mechanisms to try to continue engagement after our departure, it always comes back to bite us in the butt. And I really feel that there will be lasting impact in other conflicts we can't even imagine.
If I can respond to that just a second. I think I understand that, and that's been an important argument by Americans, that you have to stick with it, and we should have gone in and destroyed Hezbollah before it even formed at that time. But I think that's I think that's a wrong analysis of the whole Lebanon situation. And I know it's used to argue that, Reagan cut and run, and he shouldn't have. We should have stayed there and taken care of political Islam from the get-go. But I think that's wrong. Our big mistake was to help Israel invade Lebanon in 1982, try to overthrow the PLO, destroy the PLO, get rid of the Muslim and Syrian influence, and put the Christian Maronites back in power in Lebanon, a minority of the country. That was I think that was our real mistake. By doing that, we entered into that civil war, just the way we have in Afghanistan or in Iraq. And we tried to adjudicate a nation-building process that is very messy and that America didn't understand and couldn't solve. By staying in Lebanon, if Reagan had stayed in Lebanon, we would have made matters worse, and we would have gotten more Marines blown up, and we wouldn't have solved the Lebanon crisis. I think today we're doing something similar in northern Syria, where we have 1,000 troops, and we're encouraging Kurdish independence, nationalism, in order to further American interests in the region. But when we leave, all those Kurds are going to get squashed. They don't have an air force, and Turkey and the Syrian government are going to destroy them in the same way the Taliban are going to destroy America's allies in Afghanistan. So by staying in Syria, we're selling the Kurds a bill of goods, that they're going to get independence, and we're going to stick it out, and we're going to that they should trust us, work with us, and then when Assad retakes the place, somehow he's not going to kill them. But of course he will, because he'll see them as traitors and collaborators with America. And America will not stay in northern Syria and give the Kurds an independent nation. And so we're repeating this, of course, for our own short-term interests, but we're going to let down all those Kurds with a giant thump, the same way that we've let down Afghans after 20 years of occupation and asking them to trust us. This nation-building process, getting into the nation-building process and trying to build a liberal democracy in places that are in a nation-building, that have these deep divisions, I think is something America can't do, and we need to learn the lesson that we can't do it.
All right. All right. Thank you. So for our next question, I'd like to stick with the several questions that came up about the situation at present. American public opinion seems to have landed in a place that the majority of people, the significant majority, agree that pulling out was the right thing to do, but believe that we shouldn't have left in the way that we did. Is there any way to square this contradiction? What options do you think were on the table, if any, that would have been more led to less suffering and disruption, or was this inevitable, as President Biden has been claiming?
I think,
I'd like to hear from our Afghan friends.
just one thing, I was listening to Biden's speech, and when he declared that they are going to withdraw on 31st, he mentioned that President Trump made a deal and he had two choices: one, either to stick with the deal or stay in Afghanistan and cause more American death, American soldiers' death. So I think President Biden had another option. I mean, when he came to office, he had another option to even forget about what President Trump, the deal that President Trump had done with the Taliban. Just like President Trump, when he came to office, he just ignored US-Iran deal that I believe is significantly more important than what the deal between President Trump and the Taliban was in. So I think that was, I think, the first thing that could be done differently. In that time, I was talking to some colleagues about this issue, and my point was that President Biden could either not follow what President Trump has started, or he could just put more leverage and pressure on the Afghan groups in order to sit together and come up with a political settlement. That would be a more lasting solution for the problem in Afghanistan, although from the beginning, as I said, the liberal democracy would not be successful, but at least that could be another opportunity so that Afghans could sit together and come up with a solution. There was some other signals that the US could take it seriously after 2009 presidential election, 2014 presidential election, 2019 presidential election, and the whole history of Afghanistan was signaling that this system is not working, but the US did not take that seriously. I think that would be done differently, and if that route was taken, we could be in a different situation now.
And if I may just add to what Dr. Qadam Shah said, I totally agree with him that the deal with the Taliban was I mean, I don't want to say it this much strong, but was one of the US mistakes actually, because the deal was signed directly with the Taliban, excluding the Afghan government, which weakened the position of the Afghan government and made the position of Taliban much more stronger. A terrorist group was able to negotiate directly with the superpower of the world, with the US, as we all remember that in the first stages of these peace negotiations, when there were initiatives and everything, the Afghan government was totally excluded, the government that was built by the support of the international community. I also, listened to the Biden's speech on Afghanistan, and there were few issues that is my concern actually. First of all, when Biden came, he could actually support the Afghan government much more. The before administration, when the presidential election happened in Afghanistan, people were very in the US, the Afghan people were very hopeful that the Biden will put more pressure on Taliban, because the deal that have been signed during Trump administration did not have any red lines or any conditions for the Afghan people. So, we were very hopeful and optimistic about that the Biden will put more pressure and more conditions on the Taliban, which never happened. So the Taliban, because there was no pressure on them, and then in another side, there was not a structured leadership within the Afghan people to go and sit and proceed with the peace negotiation. The Taliban positions were getting stronger every day, and the government and the other side was falling apart every day. We could see that the peace negotiations were not responding. There was no progress at all, and all of these all of these did not happen in over 24 hours. I agree with Qadam Shah that there were signals. I believe that there were times that the international community, especially the US, could support Afghans and put more pressure on Taliban to avoid what has happened today.
Colonel Cabaniss, could I ask you to comment on the question too? Like, did you see opportunities for a more orderly withdrawal than were actually taken? What's your professional kind of comment or analysis of the way the withdrawal proceeded tactically and strategically?
That might be the most dangerous question to ask somebody who wasn't there. What happened? I will tell you this from my experience: there is no planning in the White House. There is no planning in the Pentagon. There is no planning in Tampa. CENTCOM's not in theater; it's in Tampa. The operational unit's the one that does the tactical level planning. So I would defer to those people on the ground. I think, as I heard, the CG of the 82nd Airborne Division was General McKenzie's man on the ground there. It's hard to say. You know, I've been through some things. I went through the elections in 2009. I went through a bunch of different things. There are ways to do this, but as everybody's talked to, once everybody knows we're going, it becomes infinitely more difficult. Now, I would never frame it as an either or. I grew up on Star Trek. There's always another way. There are a million permutations that you could take that we're going to second guess. My sense is that the Department of Defense and Central Command is going to go through this over and over and over again to see what they could do differently. What can we learn from it? But my sense is I would never question what the guys on the ground did, guys and gals on the ground did at the time. They were doing the best with what they could at the time as the country fell apart. But as one of my Afghan friends who we helped get out with this family about 36 hours before the end, is when I heard from him 10 days ago, he had lost hope. And once hope went, I think you're in a very, very different game. And so the people on the ground did the best they could with the Afghan partners that were available. But at that point, everybody was trying to get out, so I wouldn't second guess anything that they did.
I wanted to interject just quickly here. All the alternative plans I hear people talk about how we could have gotten people out seem to, again, be Kabul-centric, as I alluded to earlier. And it was keep Bagram Air Base, or we could have done better in Kabul. What about the thousands of Afghans who worked with Americans in Kandahar province? What about in Helmand province, in Mazar Sharif in the north? And how, what was how do you develop an evacuation plan with one airport is the problem. And you don't hear anything about those people who were left behind in other parts of the country, because just like our strategy was based around a central government in Kabul, so was our departure at the expense of those who lived outside the capital. No one's talking about, I don't know what's happened to translators I've worked with in Kabul. The ones I was hearing from that I was trying my little bit I could do to assist, they were already in Kabul. The others really didn't have a chance to get out in other parts of the country.
Thank you. A question came in from Ms. Abbasi that I'd like to read, and then I know she has to leave after this. The question is that the following, I'll read it. The comments from the panelists suggest remaking Afghanistan through military control was always a questionable proposition. However, the 2 decades of US military presence seem to have created space for women to contribute to critical advances in education, law, and other realms of life in Afghanistan. Are there any channels through which the US and other external actors may wield at least some influence to protect this space in the aftermath of the US military withdrawal? Ms. Abbasi?
Yeah, I would say yes. There are few options. On the table at the moment. First of all, the Taliban are much more smart than the 1990s now. They know that they need international recognition to sustain the government. They want to sustain the government. They know the international community's vocabulary now. That's why they insist. They have been insisting on forming an inclusive government in the past week. And on the top of all of this, they need money, they need budget to be able to sustain this government. The point that they want to be recognized by the international community gives leverage to the international community, especially those countries who have been present in the past 20 years in Afghanistan, to use this as a leverage on Taliban to preserve some of the gains and achievements of the past 20 years. We see that, for example, yesterday, the acting minister for education of the Taliban have already announced that women are allowed to go to schools and continue their educations, but in a safe environment where men and women are separated. This might be something possible in Kabul, where there and also he has added that men are not allowed to teach women after this. But such a thing is far from impossible in the province of Afghanistan. We don't have much educated women. We don't have enough female teachers to go to these schools. This means that most of these schools in the southern provinces of Afghanistan will be shut down. So, one of the things is to put pressure on the Taliban and use the aid and funds that is supposed to be continued in Afghanistan as a leverage on the Taliban government. Secondly, I would say to support the organizations and women advocates who are still on the ground and are trying to resist and trying to keep and preserve the gains and achievements. Although the questions have happened, I know that most of the women's rights activists, most of the people who have been working in Afghanistan have already left Afghanistan, but we do have women on the ground that are still there, and they're fighting for their freedoms, they're fighting for their individual rights. They need to be supported, they need to, their voices need to be heard, so the international community can support those women to resist against what the Taliban, to resist against whatever the Taliban rules are to restrict women's rights in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much for joining us, Ms. Abbasi. Appreciate your time. Thank you. The rest of us have 15 minutes left. We're scheduled to go up until 5:45 local time. And so, heading into the last few questions, and I'm sorry we have just an avalanche of questions that have come in. But let me ask you one that came in that seems very general and could be a good kind of platform for everybody to weigh in on. What is the best case scenario going forward that you feel has a reasonable, plausible shot of materializing? And what does this relatively good outcome in such a case look like? How would you define it? Like, what's the best case scenario going forward in a very uncertain, hostile, menacing situation?
Mohammad, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I would like to emphasize, I think I see a possibility, that is dependent on the international community again. Although, as Fereshta mentioned, Taliban are dependent on the aid. The former Afghan government was also dependent on the aid, but there wasn't any pressure, any leverage. I personally suspect that, but if I'm optimistic, I would like to see the international community altogether put pressure and have the Taliban sit with other Afghan groups and come up with a political settlement so that the inclusive government that they are claiming materialize. That is the only way out of this crisis, and that would be sustainable. If whatever solution we are thinking about should be sustainable for the future of Afghanistan. It shouldn't be a 1-year, 2-year solution or 20-year solution. It should be a solution that lasts long for Afghanistan, so that Afghans see some certainty in Afghanistan, so that they want to come back and join the process so that they can rebuild Afghanistan. Although we all kind of blamed how the international community, especially US, kind of because of the as a responsible for the situation in Afghanistan, part of it goes back to the Afghans themselves too. So I don't know any country in the world that the international community or a certain great power like Britain, US, or Soviet Union have gone to, and they have rebuilt them from the scratch. At some point, the national leaders should stand up, should sacrifice their personal interest, and just give up their personal interest and just work for the good of their country. We should just learn from US. US history is just exemplary. Those 13 colonies, President Washington didn't want to be a king. He just gave up and he sacrificed, and he said that, okay, I'm going to give up. But we didn't see that example from Afghan leaders. We have not seen that from the Afghan leaders so far. A very recent example is our president, who was very stubborn in sitting to be a president. He didn't for a minute gave up, although he announced that he would resign. I didn't believe in him for a second because I know he is selfish, he is stubborn, and he just one model in his mind, and that is what Afghanistan started 200 years ago. So that is what Afghanistan needs. I mean, the international community pressure and some sacrifice from the Afghans themselves too.
I would, if I can jump in here, I would say I hope that the United States does not place sanctions on Afghanistan the way it has on Syria and Iran and a number of other countries like Venezuela and so forth, because the sanctions that America can put on today are really crushing. And I know in Syria, where I have family, people are facing starvation because there's secondary sanctions. Anybody who does business gets put on a list. And that would devastate Afghanistan. Afghanistan, more than 50% of the budget comes from outside the country. We know that the $10 billion in reserves have been frozen, the World Bank, IMF, the list goes on. It would be very easy to crush Afghanistan. And that would be to really punish all the people of Afghanistan, because we're not going to change the Taliban fundamentally. I think we need to try to negotiate with the Taliban for things that are possible to do. And that may be not very much. But that's, people who know more about the politics of the Taliban would understand what those are. But to put such strong conditions on that for international funds and international engagement and trade, when it's quite clear that Taliban want to engage, they need to engage. And I think to get greater liberalism and to defang the Taliban in the future, it's better to encourage them to engage with the world and to trade with the world, rather than to close in on themselves and to face sanctions and poverty, which could very well happen.
Any other point of view on that question, or do you all agree with Professor Landis?
No, I agree with what Josh is saying. There should not be sanctions, but I think we do have leverage with Afghan reserves and American banks frozen. We have, and my personal feeling is that's something we should not be sitting on, but use that leverage we do have to try to influence the new Taliban government to open up to the world. But I think we've talked this whole hour so far, and no one's mentioned Pakistan once. And I think that's one of the lessons of this war and the lessons of Vietnam. fighting an asymmetrical war where your enemy has safe haven that you can't cross into, like existed in Cambodia and Laos and like existed in Pakistan, you can't win that. And I think that as we go forward into the new phase, Afghanistan, of course, will play a crucial and huge role. And we need to use every bit of influence we have that perhaps we didn't use in the last 20 years to pressure Pakistan, to pressure the Taliban, there's going to be no liberal democracy there, but at least have a system of government that's not rooted in the 14th century.
So clustering several questions on the regional fallout. So such as this question, what about the influences of neighboring countries and how the Taliban will govern Afghanistan? Iran, Pakistan, India, Tajikistan, and China. A couple of other questions were focused on China and what role it will play going forward, and will it consolidate, greater influence in the country. Would anyone like to take on any of the regional themes and fallout in either direction?
Well, I think I just did on Pakistan, and I think that is, that is the best play right now for regional influence. The Chinese, investment-wise, have been moving to influence Afghanistan because of the great mineral wealth that it sits on for quite some time. But I don't, I think that I think that I think that the major players, and especially feel this in the eastern part of the country, is that we need to work with Pakistan, we need to work with India, and we need to work with China in terms, in some way or another, hate each other for something, but in their own economic self-interest and own security self-interest, convince them to create a positive influence in Afghanistan. But frankly, that didn't happen in the last 20 years, and I don't see it happening in the short term right now with the Taliban.
All right, the final question, again, clustering a few of them, around accountability. Who is the main winner of this war, and what lessons the United States should draw from it? So, question, how should we think about accountability beyond George Bush, as Professor Landis was mentioning, as the main person responsible? And in terms of the main winner, we had a comment from a member of the audience that the main winner of the war is defense contractors, whose stock raised 58% and millions of dollars transferred from the American people to do this. When will we learn? And a couple of others were asking for general lessons that the United States should draw out. So I just leave that as an open question about accountability and overall lessons that you would draw. And we can go out on that question, perhaps.
Well, I would say, I'm just looking at the figures here. During the war in Afghanistan, Congress gave 5 companies $2 trillion: Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, and Lockheed Martin. We talk about the corruption of the system in Afghanistan, but we forget that our own system can be corrupted when huge political donors tend to make trillions of dollars. I think the big winners in Afghanistan were corrupt government officials. And you're right, the military contractors. But I will say one thing, the silver lining on all of this. I believe in the last 20 years with the empowerment of women, the connection with many Afghans to the outside world, that the U.S. has planted the seeds for the Taliban's eventual destruction. Because those aspirations probably will not be met by the Taliban. And so going forward, the Taliban is facing that legacy that the U.S. left behind. You know, I don't see empowered women of Afghanistan suddenly going back to the burqas and not saying a word. I see that the, you know, of Afghans and who've had that connection with the world and in a society interconnected by the web, and that connectivity to the outside world, aided by the United States and its investment. I think that those things are things that the Taliban can't ignore and are the eventual seeds for their own destruction as a government.
I think a lesson to be drawn from this is not that the U.S. should fight more impossible wars for longer in search of credibility, but they should, you know, hold those people responsible for bad decisions. And U.S. allies should take heart that the U.S. is no longer shooting itself in the foot and that it's still able to correct its course. U.S. remains the strongest, you know, country militarily in the world. We haven't lost our position, and I think this only strengthens us. Unfortunately, I hope we don't arm, and I hope others don't arm factions and warlords within Afghanistan in order to weaken the Taliban, because the civil war has gone on long enough. And when we talk about the 2,000 plus American soldiers who were killed and the many who were wounded, and but when we look at the number of Afghan people who've been killed by this enduring civil war, it's a very high number indeed. And you know, China, Russia, and Iran all are beginning to engage with the Taliban, thinking that they are going to be winners out of this. To answer your, but it's not clear. Nobody would have chosen the Taliban to win. China has many difficulties to face with an emboldened Taliban on their neighbors with the Uyghurs. They're terrified of Islamic extremism, and this presents a real danger to them. Islamists and jihadists took heart from one end of the Middle East to the other with the win of the Taliban. In Syria and other places, people were applauding this, and it scared many, and it will scare China as well. So, and it'll scare Iran. They're all gingerly, and Russia too, which faces a lot of Islamic extremism itself. They're all approaching the Taliban, hoping that they can denature this aspect, but everybody is frightened, and hopefully they will restrain the Taliban and make the kind of deals that are important, so that the Taliban will rein in groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS, and become members of the international community that can be counted on to uphold some law and order.
Mohammad, would you like to have a closing word?
Yeah, I think in terms of lesson, I think the lesson is that, again, liberal democracy without considering the local condition and realities would not be possible. I mean, US has done the same thing for a very long time. Afghanistan is not the only experiment. From Latin America to Asia to all these countries, US have pursued the same policy. And for me, as long as there is this geopolitical, political and economic interest above the self-interest or the public interest of a given country, the state building or military operations would not resolve the problem of these people. And to that extent, I see a big major contradiction and dilemma in the sense that from one side they want to triumph a war, and from the other side they want to install a government that is legitimate. The history and the experience shows that there is always that legitimacy lacking. And for the case of Afghanistan, again, I think the Afghans should stand up and just work together for the good of their country. And the international community and support is always for sure for Afghanistan in this situation necessary. But ultimately, Afghans should just stand up and believe in themselves and work together.
Thank you.
Dean Fritzen, could you mind quickly if I ask Christian one?
No, please do. Yeah, by all means.
To close out, Christian,
Sure.
I remember before, as you were preparing for the offensive during the surge through the Helmand River Valley, you had the Marines gathered around you and you told them, change the course of history. Do you think your Marines, even on this day when the U.S. is lost, those Marines who fought there, did they change, and soldiers, did they change the course of history?
It goes back to the question, was it worth it? And I have to believe that it was, and I have to believe that they did. It did not turn out as we had wished. Whether or not we were ever going to be able to achieve that goal is irrelevant at this point. But I think the individual impacts, Marines, sailors, and soldiers and airmen in my battle space with those Afghans changed them forever and their view about what is possible in the world. So I do think they changed the course of history, but only time will tell. I'm a complexity theory guy, so there's a broad range of things that could happen, and most of the outcomes are bad. But I think we maybe nudged it in a little bit better direction. But again, this is something that the Afghans are going to have to pick up on their own, the people of Garmsir. Maybe they will make the world a little bit better place for their children, because Lord knows they deserve it.
Well, that's a profound word to close on. Colonel Cabaniss, Joshua Landis, Mohammad Qadam Shah, Mike Boettcher, and of course, Fereshta Abbasi, who had to leave early. Thank you all for coming together and offering your insights today. And thank you to the 70 plus participants who joined us as well. Please stay in touch with us here at the College of International Studies, and we will continue to roll out such events in the coming weeks. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Pleasure.